There is a kind of person who moves through this world carrying something they cannot name. They feel it in the quiet hours before dawn, in the ache that follows a success nobody else seems to notice, in the strange discomfort of a life that looks fine on paper but feels unfinished in the soul. If you have ever sensed that you were built for something heavier than the life you are currently living, then what follows is not a coincidence. It is a mirror. Every generation produces a small number of people who are marked, not by luck, not by talent alone, and not by the approval of the crowd, but by a particular kind of suffering, a particular kind of hunger, and a particular kind of solitude that the world rarely understands and even more rarely rewards in the moment it is happening. The ancients called them the chosen. The Stoics called them the ones who had learned to separate what is theirs from what is not. The old prophets called them the tested. And across every culture, every era, and every philosophy that has tried to explain why some people rise out of ruin while others are broken by comfort, three unmistakable marks appear again and again on the same kind of person. These marks are rarely celebrated while they are happening. They look, from the outside, like misfortune. But if you can learn to recognize them in yourself, you will stop mistaking your greatest asset for your greatest curse. The first mark is a solitude that nobody chose for you and that you cannot explain to the people who love you. It is the sense of being surrounded by people and still feeling like the only one in the room who understands what is actually happening to you. This is not the ordinary loneliness of an empty calendar or a quiet weekend. It is something stranger and more specific. It is the loneliness of growth. It is what happens when your mind starts asking questions that the people around you have never thought to ask, when your standards begin rising faster than the patience of the people who used to be your closest company, when your instincts start warning you about situations and relationships that everyone else insists are perfectly fine. The chosen carry this solitude long before they carry any title, any success, or any recognition. It arrives first, and it arrives uninvited, and it does its work in silence, stripping away the noise of belonging so that something sturdier can be built underneath. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire, still rose before dawn to argue with his own resistance, reminding himself in private that the work of a human being was not to be liked but to be useful, not to be comfortable but to be awake. He wrote his private reflections not for an audience but because he had nowhere else to put the weight of command. That is the first mark in its purest form. A person who has been given a burden that cannot be fully explained to anyone else, and who must learn to carry it in silence while still showing up, still functioning, still leading, still loving the people around them even though those people cannot see what they see or feel what they feel. If you have felt this kind of solitude, you have probably also felt guilty about it. You have looked at the people who love you, who show up for you, who would do almost anything for you, and you have wondered what is wrong with you that you still feel alone in their presence. Nothing is wrong with you. What is happening is that you are outgrowing a version of connection that used to be enough, and the ache you feel is not a flaw in your character, it is evidence of expansion. A tree does not apologize for growing past the fence that once contained it. It simply grows, and the fence either stretches or breaks. The chosen are not chosen because they are lonelier than everyone else by nature. They are chosen because they are willing to endure the discomfort of that early solitude instead of shrinking themselves back down to fit inside relationships, jobs, and identities that no longer match who they are becoming. This is where faith and Stoic philosophy meet in a way that most people never notice. The Stoic discipline of desire teaches that peace comes from wanting only what is within your control, and nothing exhausts a person faster than trying to control how others understand them. The chosen learn, often the hard way, to release the desire to be fully understood by everyone around them. They learn to let people love them without needing those people to comprehend the internal war being fought behind their eyes. And in the language of faith, this solitude is often described as a wilderness season, a period where the noise of the crowd is stripped away specifically so a person can hear something quieter and more essential underneath it. Moses did not become who he was in the palace. He became who he was in 40 years of silence tending sheep in a desert nobody was watching. Joseph did not become who he was in his father's favor. He became who he was in a pit, then in a prison, forgotten by the very people he had helped, learning patience in circumstances that offered him no reason to have any. The wilderness is not punishment. It is preparation disguised as abandonment. If you are in a season right now where you feel disconnected from people who used to feel like home, where conversations that used to satisfy you now leave you empty, where you find yourself watching the room instead of participating in it, do not rush to fix this by forcing yourself back into old patterns. Ask instead what this solitude is making room for. The first mark of the chosen is not a punishment for being different. It is the necessary quiet before a much louder purpose. Nobody builds anything sacred in constant noise. The masterpieces of Scripture were written in exile, in prison cells, on islands of banishment. The masterpieces of philosophy were often composed by men who had lost their freedom, their titles, or their comfort. Solitude is the furnace, and if you can stop resenting it and start listening inside it, you will find that it was never trying to isolate you from your life. It was trying to introduce you to yourself. There is a second layer to this first mark that deserves its own attention, because it explains why so many capable, gifted, hardworking people quietly suffer without ever telling anyone the truth of what they are carrying. It is the specific loneliness of being the strong one. If you have spent years being the person others lean on, the one who stays calm in the crisis, the one who has the answers, the one who shows up even when nobody asks how you are doing, you already know this loneliness intimately. The world rewards competence with more responsibility, not more comfort. It hands you other people's burdens and rarely asks whether you have set your own down first. This is not accidental. It is part of the shaping. The chosen are frequently the ones who learn endurance early, often earlier than is fair, because life has a habit of testing the very people who will one day need to hold more weight than others. The Stoics would tell you that this is simply the nature of a well-built vessel. It is not filled with light cargo. It is trusted with the heavy load precisely because it has already proven, quietly and repeatedly, that it will not break. The second mark is delay. Not failure, not rejection in any final sense, but a delay so prolonged and so specific that it feels, at times, like being cursed rather than prepared. This is the mark that breaks the most people, because delay does not announce itself as preparation. It presents itself as evidence that you were wrong about yourself all along. You had a vision for your life, a sense of what you were capable of, a quiet conviction that you were meant for more than your current circumstances, and then years pass, doors close, opportunities go to people who seem far less committed than you, and the silence from the universe, or from God, or from whatever force you believe governs the timing of things, becomes almost unbearable. This is the second mark, and it is universal among people who eventually accomplish something that outlives them. Delay is not the opposite of destiny. It is one of the primary tools destiny uses to build the character strong enough to survive the very thing it was delaying you for. Consider the account of David, anointed as king while he was still a shepherd boy tending animals nobody else wanted to watch. The anointing did not come with an immediate throne. It came with years of running, hiding in caves, being hunted by the very kingdom he was destined to inherit. If the story had gone according to human timing, David would have been crowned the week after the prophet poured oil on his head. Instead, there were more than a decade of hardship between the promise and its fulfillment, and in that decade, David wrote some of the most enduring words about anguish, doubt, and faith that have ever been written. The delay was not wasted time. It was the actual construction site where the version of him capable of ruling wisely was being built, plank by plank, in circumstances that offered him every reason to become bitter and somehow did not. The Stoic view of time reinforces this without needing any reference to prophecy at all. Seneca wrote extensively about how people waste the only resource they cannot recover, which is time itself, by spending it resentful of a present moment that has not yet delivered what they were promised. He argued that the wise person treats every day as complete in itself rather than as a means to some future arrival, because a life spent constantly waiting for the real chapter to begin is a life that never actually gets lived. This does not mean the chosen are supposed to abandon their ambitions or stop pursuing what they were built for. It means they are meant to stop outsourcing their peace to a future date they do not control. The delay becomes bearable, even meaningful, the moment a person decides to build inside the waiting room instead of merely surviving it. If you are in a season of delay right now, here is what almost nobody tells you about it. Delay is doing 4 specific things at once, even when it feels like it is doing nothing. It is testing whether your desire for the outcome is strong enough to survive boredom, which is a far more accurate test than testing whether it can survive a single dramatic crisis. It is stripping away the version of the goal that was actually about ego, applause, or proving something to people who never believed in you, so that what remains is the version rooted in something sturdier. It is quietly building the skills, relationships, and internal resilience that the eventual assignment will require, often in ways you cannot see or measure while it is happening. And it is separating you from people who are only ever going to be compatible with the smaller, earlier version of your life, making room for the different kind of company the next chapter will actually require. None of this shows up on a calendar. None of this feels like progress while you are living it. But every person who eventually looks back on a period of delay describes it the same way, as the part of the story they would never trade away, even though they hated it while it was happening. There is a particular cruelty to delay that deserves to be named honestly instead of spiritualized away too quickly, because false comfort helps no one. Watching people who started after you finished before you is one of the more painful experiences a driven person can endure. It tempts a very specific and very human response, which is to conclude that effort does not matter, that timing is random, that you were simply overlooked. The temptation is understandable. It is also, almost without exception, wrong. The Stoics drew a hard line between the things within your control, which are your effort, your character, your response to circumstance, and the things outside your control, which include the pace at which the world recognizes you. Peace was never meant to come from controlling the second category. It comes from mastering the first so completely that the second eventually has no choice but to respond. This is not a promise that it will respond on your preferred schedule. It is a promise that character built in delay does not evaporate once recognition finally arrives, while recognition that arrives too early, before the character is ready to hold it, tends to destroy the very people it was given to. The third mark is the most misunderstood of all, because it does not look like suffering at all. It looks like restlessness, and restlessness is easy to dismiss as ingratitude, greed, or an inability to be satisfied. But the third mark of the chosen is a specific kind of holy discontent, a persistent sense that comfort was never the point, that ease is not the same thing as fulfillment, and that a life spent avoiding difficulty is not actually a life spent well. This is the mark that keeps a person moving long after most people would have settled, not because they are ungrateful for what they have, but because something inside them refuses to mistake safety for purpose. It is the reason some people cannot simply enjoy a stable job, a comfortable routine, and a predictable future the way everyone around them seems to. It is not a character flaw. It is a compass, and compasses are supposed to keep pointing somewhere even when the ship is already anchored in a perfectly nice harbor. This restlessness has a long and well-documented history among people who eventually change something larger than themselves. It rarely looks impressive from the outside while it is happening. It often looks like an inability to be content, a habit of leaving good situations for uncertain ones, a frustrating unwillingness to simply relax and enjoy what has already been built. Family members worry about it. Friends question it. And the person carrying it often cannot fully explain it either, except to say that staying still feels like a slow kind of dying, even when staying still would be the easier and more sensible choice by every external measure. The Stoics had a word for the deeper alignment this restlessness is chasing, which they called living according to nature, meaning living in full agreement with the reasoning, purposeful capacity that a human being actually possesses rather than settling for mere physical comfort, which any animal can achieve without effort. A life aimed only at comfort, they argued, is a life beneath the dignity of a being capable of virtue, wisdom, and purpose. The restlessness of the chosen is simply that argument playing out inside a single human chest, refusing to let its owner settle for less than what they were actually built to become. Faith traditions describe this same restlessness as a kind of homesickness for a purpose not yet fully arrived. It is the sense that you were made for meaning, not merely for maintenance, and that a life spent only maintaining what already exists, without ever building, creating, or contributing something new, will always feel slightly hollow no matter how comfortable it becomes. This is why so many people who achieve conventional success still describe an emptiness they cannot explain to anyone who has not felt it. They followed every rule, hit every milestone, secured every form of stability the culture told them to want, and still, quietly, at night, they feel the same ache that they felt before any of it existed. The ache was never about the achievements. It was about alignment. The third mark is not asking you to abandon stability. It is asking you to stop mistaking stability for the destination, when it was only ever meant to be the base camp from which the actual climb begins. If this restlessness is familiar to you, you have probably spent years feeling like something is wrong with your ability to simply be happy with what you have. Let this be the moment that reframes it. The chosen are not chosen because they are incapable of gratitude. Most of them are deeply grateful people, aware of exactly how much worse their story could have gone, humbled by every door that opened when it did not have to. But gratitude for what has already happened and hunger for what has not yet happened are not opposites. They coexist constantly in the same person, and learning to hold both without guilt is one of the quieter forms of maturity that nobody teaches directly. You can thank God, or life, or whatever you believe governs your story, for every good thing you already have, and still feel the pull towards something further, and both of those feelings can be entirely true at the same time without canceling each other out. There is a practical danger hidden inside this third mark, and it deserves to be named plainly, because restlessness without discipline burns just as many people as complacency does. The same hunger that drives a person toward their purpose can, unmanaged, drive them into constant reinvention, chronic dissatisfaction, and an inability to finish anything before chasing the next shiny direction. The Stoics offered a corrective for exactly this danger, insisting that virtue, not novelty, was the only true good, and that a person chasing external change without internal discipline would simply relocate their unhappiness rather than resolve it. The chosen are not meant to run from place to place, job to job, relationship to relationship, endlessly searching for the external condition that will finally quiet the restlessness. The restlessness was never going to be quieted by an external condition. It is quieted only by alignment between what a person does daily and what they were actually built to do, and that alignment is achieved through disciplined, patient, unglamorous effort in one direction over time, not through the endless pursuit of a different door every time the current one gets difficult. What makes these three marks so difficult to recognize in real time is that they rarely arrive one at a time in a tidy sequence. They overlap. You can be sitting in the solitude of the first mark, watching relationships you once relied on quietly fall away, while simultaneously enduring the delay of the second mark, watching people less committed than you receive the very things you have been working toward for years, while also carrying the restlessness of the third mark. Unable to fully rest in whatever comfort you do have because something inside you insists there is more waiting on the other side of your obedience. Any one of these alone would be difficult. All three at once, arriving in the same season of life, is enough to make a person question their sanity, their faith, and their worth. This is precisely why so few people make it through to the other side of their calling. It is not that the calling is rare. It is that the willingness to endure all three marks simultaneously, without abandoning the process out of exhaustion or bitterness, is rare. There is an old pattern that shows up again and again across scripture, philosophy, and history, and it is worth naming directly because it explains why the marks feel so unfair while they are happening. Before anything of lasting value is entrusted to a person, that person is tested in private, in obscurity, and often in circumstances that look nothing like the eventual assignment. Joseph interpreted dreams in a prison cell before he ever interpreted them in a palace. David fought lions and bears in a field before he ever fought Goliath in front of a watching nation. The philosopher Epictetus spent part of his life enslaved before he became one of the most influential teachers of freedom the ancient world ever produced, teaching that no external circumstance, not even literal bondage, could control the one thing that actually mattered, which was the disposition of his own mind. None of these people were tested in front of an audience. They were tested when no one was watching, which is exactly the point. Character built for an audience is character built on sand. Character built in private, tested in obscurity, and refined through delay is the only kind sturdy enough to hold real weight once the audience finally arrives. This is worth sitting with honestly, because it reframes every season of hidden struggle you have ever gone through. If you have ever wondered why your hardest battles seem to happen when nobody is around to witness them, why your greatest tests of character occur in rooms nobody will ever know about, why your integrity is challenged most severely in moments that will never make it onto a resume or a highlight reel, the answer is not that your life is unfair or that you are unlucky. The answer is that you are being prepared in the only place preparation actually happens, which is away from applause. Applause does not build character. It merely reveals whatever character was already built beforehand, for better or worse. If you want to know what kind of person you actually are, do not look at how you behave when people are watching. Look at how you behave in the delay, in the solitude, in the restlessness, when there is no one to perform for and nothing to gain except the quiet satisfaction of knowing you did not compromise. There is also a subtler test hidden inside all three marks that most people miss entirely, and it has to do with envy. The chosen are frequently placed in close enough proximity to people receiving the very things they themselves are still waiting for, that envy becomes almost unavoidable unless it is actively resisted. This is not accidental either. It is one of the more precise tests built into the process, because envy left unchecked corrodes exactly the kind of character the delay was supposed to be building. The Stoic response to this is direct and unsentimental. Another person's timeline, another person's success, another person's recognition, has absolutely no bearing on your own worth or your own eventual outcome, and spending your limited attention resenting it is simply theft from your own progress. The person who learns to genuinely celebrate someone else's breakthrough while still waiting for their own is demonstrating a level of internal security that most people never reach, and that security is not a minor personality trait. It is often the exact quality the eventual calling requires, because leadership, influence, and impact all demand the ability to celebrate others without feeling threatened by them. It is worth pausing here to ask a more practical question, because recognizing the three marks is only useful if it changes how you actually live inside them. What does a person do, day to day, while carrying solitude, delay, and restlessness all at once, without collapsing into despair on one side or numbing themselves into false contentment on the other? The Stoics offered a discipline for exactly this problem, and it begins with a single, deceptively simple distinction: separate what is yours to control from what is not, and pour your entire effort into the first category while releasing your grip on the second. You cannot control when recognition arrives. You can control whether you show up with excellence today. You cannot control whether people understand what you are carrying. You can control whether you remain kind, honest, and disciplined regardless of whether they do. You cannot control the outcome of the calling. You can control the quality of your obedience to it in this specific hour, on this specific day, in this specific season that feels like it will never end but will, eventually end. This distinction sounds almost too simple to matter, and yet it is the entire architecture behind every person who has endured the three marks without being destroyed by them. Practicing it daily looks unglamorous. It looks like waking up and doing the work anyway, even though no one applauded you yesterday. It looks like showing up to the relationship, the craft, the discipline, the faith practice, with full effort, even though the results have not yet caught up to the effort. It looks like refusing to let a delayed outcome become an excuse for present-day mediocrity, because the two are not actually connected the way despair tries to convince you they are. You do not have to feel ready, recognized, or fulfilled in order to act with excellence today. In fact, the willingness to act with excellence before any of those feelings arrive is precisely what the three marks are testing for. Feelings are notoriously unreliable narrators of a person's actual readiness. Consistent action, especially consistent action taken without an audience, and without immediate reward, is a far more honest measure, and it is the measure that eventually earns the trust required for larger assignments. There is a second practice worth naming here, drawn as much from ancient faith traditions as from Stoic discipline, and it is the practice of gratitude aimed specifically at the difficulty itself, not merely at the good things surrounding it. This is a harder practice than ordinary gratitude, because ordinary gratitude thanks life for the blessings while quietly resenting the obstacles standing between the person and more blessings. The deeper practice thanks the obstacle itself, on the theory that the obstacle is not separate from the path but is, in fact, the path. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this directly, describing how the very thing that blocks an action can be turned to advance it, how what stands in the way becomes the way. This is not a comfortable idea to accept while you are in pain. It is, however, one of the more liberating ideas available to a person who has grown exhausted from treating their hardship as a mistake that needs correcting rather than as material that can be used. Every delay you have endured, every solitary season you have survived, every restless night spent wanting more than your current circumstances offered, is not waste. It is raw material. The question is not whether you will be given that material. You already have been. The question is only what you choose to build with it. There is an ancient story about a man who spent 13 years enslaved and imprisoned before ever stepping into the role he was actually destined for, and what stands out about his account is not the suffering itself but his response to it once the suffering had ended. When the moment finally came for him to confront the very people who had wronged him, the ones who had sold him into slavery and left him for dead in every practical sense, he did not respond with the bitterness that 13 years of injustice would have more than justified. He told them plainly that what they had intended for harm had been used for a greater purpose, one that ultimately preserved many lives. This is not a naive statement made by someone who had forgotten what was done to him. It is a conclusion reached only after years of processing pain honestly, refusing to let it calcify into permanent resentment, and choosing instead to let it become the foundation of a wisdom he could not have developed any other way. This is the endpoint the three marks are aiming a person toward, not a life free of injustice, delay, or solitude, but a life mature enough to metabolize all three into something that serves others rather than something that poisons the one carrying it. The same pattern shows up, stripped of any religious framing at all, in the life of a man born into slavery who became one of the most respected philosophy teachers of the ancient world. He lost his freedom as a child, suffered physical injury at the hands of a master, and yet built, from inside those circumstances, a body of teaching that entire civilizations have leaned on for 2,000 years to make sense of adversity. His central insight was almost defiantly simple: circumstances themselves are neutral, and it is the judgment a person forms about those circumstances that determines whether they experience peace or torment. This is not a denial of real suffering. It is an insistence that suffering does not get the final word over a person's internal freedom, no matter how thoroughly it may control their external circumstances. If a man born into slavery could reach that conclusion and teach it credibly to others, the solitude, delay, and restlessness that mark your own life, however severe they may feel, are not disqualifying. They are simply the raw material every generation before you has had to work with, in different forms, on the way to becoming something more solid than comfort alone could ever produce. It is worth being honest about one more thing before moving further, because false positivity has ruined more sincere efforts at encouragement than almost anything else. Not every delay ends in vindication that arrives neatly on schedule, and not every season of solitude resolves into a clear and satisfying purpose within a timeframe anyone would consider reasonable. Some people carry these marks for far longer than feels bearable, and some carry versions of them for the rest of their lives without ever receiving the tidy resolution their story seems to be building toward. This is not a flaw in the framework. It is a necessary correction to the version of this message that oversimplifies suffering into a guaranteed formula for future success, which is both dishonest and, ultimately, cruel to the people still waiting. The purpose of recognizing these marks is not to guarantee a specific outcome on a specific timeline. It is to change how you interpret the waiting itself, so that even in seasons without visible resolution, you are not wasting the difficulty. You are still becoming someone, whether or not the world ever formally acknowledges what that becoming costs you. There is a question worth asking yourself honestly at this point, and it is more useful than the question of whether you are chosen at all. The more useful question is whether you are willing to become the kind of person who could carry what being chosen would actually require. It is easy to want the outcome. It is far rarer to want the process that produces the character capable of sustaining that outcome without being destroyed by it. Many people say they want influence without wanting the solitude that precedes it. Many people say they want breakthrough without wanting the delay that refines it. Many people say they want purpose without wanting the restlessness that keeps them from settling for a smaller life than the one they were built for. The 3 marks are not a punishment inflicted on people who did something wrong. They are the precise conditions required to build someone strong enough to hold what they are asking for. Wanting the reward while resenting the process is one of the most common reasons people abandon their calling exactly one season before it would have arrived. This is where the Stoic concept of amor fati becomes not just a philosophical position but a practical survival tool. Amor fati means the love of one's fate, not a passive resignation to whatever happens, but an active embrace of it, a decision to work with the material of your actual life rather than the material of the life you wish you had instead. This does not mean pretending the solitude did not hurt, or that the delay was not agonizing, or that the restlessness has not cost you real peace along the way. It means refusing to spend your remaining days fighting a version of your story that no longer exists, and instead asking what can be built from the version that does exist. Nietzsche, who studied the Stoics closely, described the highest form of this attitude as not merely enduring necessity but loving it, wanting nothing to be different, not in the past, not in the future, not for all eternity. Few people ever reach that height of acceptance, and you do not need to reach it perfectly to benefit from moving toward it. Even a partial embrace of your actual circumstances, instead of a constant war against them, frees up an enormous amount of energy that was previously being spent on resentment, energy that can now be redirected toward the work in front of you. Faith traditions describe a nearly identical posture using different language, framing surrender not as defeat but as the doorway through which real strength enters. The instruction to be still and know is not a suggestion to become passive or to stop working toward your purpose. It is an instruction to stop striving against the process itself, to stop treating every difficulty as evidence that something has gone wrong, and to trust that the same force capable of ordering the movement of stars is capable of ordering the timeline of a single human life, even when that timeline makes no sense from the inside. This is not an easy trust to hold. It is, in fact, one of the hardest disciplines a person can practice, precisely because it requires releasing control over outcomes that feel too important to leave unmanaged. But the alternative, gripping tightly to a timeline you cannot actually control, produces nothing except exhaustion and bitterness, without ever once speeding up the process it is trying so desperately to accelerate. There is a final layer to all of this that most conversations about calling and purpose skip entirely, and it has to do with what you actually do with the marks once you recognize them in yourself. Recognition alone is not transformation. Plenty of people can watch a video like this one, nod along, feel briefly understood, and then return to the exact same patterns that were keeping them stuck before they ever pressed play. The 3 marks are not meant to be admired from a distance as an interesting theory about suffering. They are meant to be lived through, deliberately, with intention, in a way that actually changes the daily texture of your life. This means, practically, building a small number of disciplines that you return to regardless of how you feel on a given day, because feelings during seasons of solitude, delay, and restlessness are notoriously unreliable, and a life built entirely on feeling ready will rarely produce anything of lasting substance. The first discipline is a daily practice of honest reflection, something the Stoics called an examination of the day, a brief and unsentimental review of where you acted with integrity and where you fell short, not for the purpose of self-punishment but for the purpose of course correction. This single habit, practiced consistently, does more to build the character required for a larger calling than almost any other single action available to you, because it keeps you accountable to yourself in the private hours when no one else is watching, which is precisely where the 3 marks are doing most of their work. The second discipline is a refusal to compare your specific timeline to anyone else's, not as a naive denial of the pain that comparison causes but as an active, repeated redirection of attention back toward the only race that actually matters, which is the one between who you were yesterday and who you are becoming today. The third discipline is service rendered even in seasons of personal lack, because one of the most reliable ways to interrupt the downward spiral of resentment that solitude, delay, and restlessness can produce is to turn your attention outward, toward someone else's need, even when your own need has not yet been met. This is not a distraction from your own healing. It is, paradoxically, one of the fastest paths toward it. None of these disciplines require you to have already arrived anywhere. They require only a willingness to keep showing up inside the difficulty instead of waiting for the difficulty to end before you start living with purpose. This is the actual secret hidden inside the 3 marks, the thing that separates the people who eventually become who they were meant to be from the people who spend their entire lives waiting for permission to begin. The permission was never coming from outside. The solitude was never going to feel comfortable before you decided to stop resenting it. The delay was never going to announce its ending in advance. The restlessness was never going to quiet itself until you gave it a disciplined direction instead of an endless search for the next escape. The marks are not proof that you are stuck. They are proof that something in you refused to settle for a smaller story, and that refusal, uncomfortable as it has been, is the very thing that will eventually set you apart. Look honestly at your own life for a moment. Not at the highlight reel you present to others but at the private texture of your days, and ask which of these 3 marks you recognize most clearly in yourself right now. Perhaps it is the solitude, the sense of standing slightly apart from people who love you but cannot fully see what you are carrying. Perhaps it is the delay, the exhausting experience of watching your effort go unrewarded while people who started later seem to move faster. Perhaps it is the restlessness, the inability to simply relax into a comfortable life because something inside you insists there is more waiting for you than what you currently have. Whichever one feels most familiar, resist the urge to treat it as a problem that needs to be solved before you can move forward. Treat it instead as information, a signal about the specific kind of shaping currently underway in your life, and let that information change how you respond to it rather than how much you resent it. It is worth remembering that none of the figures referenced throughout this reflection, whether drawn from ancient philosophy or from the deep well of faith traditions, experienced their formation as a pleasant process while it was happening. There is no record of anyone in genuine preparation describing the wilderness as enjoyable, the prison as comfortable, or the years of delay as easy to bear. Every account, honestly told, includes real anguish, real doubt, and real moments of wanting to quit entirely. What separates the ones whose stories we still study centuries later is not the absence of that anguish, but their refusal to let it become the final chapter. They kept doing the next right thing in front of them, even when the next right thing felt pointless, even when nobody was watching, even when the outcome remained completely uncertain. That refusal, repeated daily over years rather than performed once dramatically, is what the world eventually calls chosen, even though it looked, at the time, like nothing more than stubborn persistence in the dark. There is a temptation, once a person begins to recognize these marks in themselves, to treat the recognition as an excuse for spiritual bypassing, using the language of preparation and purpose to avoid doing the practical work that any real change requires. This is worth naming directly, because it is a trap many well-meaning people fall into. Believing you are being prepared for something greater is not a substitute for actually developing the skills that greater assignment will require. Trusting that delay is purposeful does not excuse passivity in the areas of your life you actually can influence. Recognizing restlessness as a compass does not mean abandoning every commitment the moment it becomes difficult. The 3 marks are meant to reframe suffering you cannot control, not to justify avoiding effort you absolutely can control. A person who understands this distinction uses the framework to endure hardship with more resilience while still doing the daily, unglamorous work of building actual competence, actual character, and actual readiness for whatever door eventually opens. There is one more dimension to this that rarely gets discussed openly, and it concerns what happens after the marks have done their work, once solitude has taught its lessons, delay has finally broken, and restlessness has settled into disciplined direction. Many people assume that the arrival of the long-awaited outcome will feel like relief, like finally exhaling after years of holding their breath. Often it does not feel that way at all, at least not immediately. It feels strange, even disorienting, because the person who finally receives the outcome is no longer the same person who first wanted it. Years of solitude have changed what companionship means to them. Years of delay have changed what success actually satisfies in them. Years of restlessness have changed what rest even looks like for them. This is not a design flaw. It is proof that the process worked. The whole point of the 3 marks was never simply to deliver an external outcome to an unchanged person. It was to change the person into someone capable of stewarding that outcome without being ruined by it, the way sudden wealth ruins people who were never taught patience, or sudden platform ruins people who were never tested in obscurity. This is why so many stories of dramatic, overnight success end badly, while stories built on the slow architecture of solitude, delay, and restlessness tend to endure. The person who receives recognition before their character has caught up to it usually cannot hold it, because nothing in their private formation prepared them for the weight of it. The person who has spent years in the wilderness, tested in the pit, refined through the delay, arrives at the outcome already knowing how to hold it without being consumed by it, because they have already survived far harder things in far more obscure circumstances. If you are currently in the middle of your own version of this process, take real comfort in this. The very difficulty you are enduring is quietly building the only kind of person capable of surviving what you are asking for. You are not being punished by the weight. You are being prepared by it, whether or not the outcome ever arrives in the form or the timeline you originally imagined. Consider, finally, what it would mean to stop asking when the marks will end and start asking instead who you are becoming while you carry them. This single shift in question changes almost everything about how a season of hardship is experienced. Asking when it will end keeps your attention fixed on a future you cannot control, guaranteeing frustration in every present moment that fails to deliver the ending you are demanding. Asking who you are becoming redirects your attention to the only place you actually have influence, which is your own character, your own discipline, your own daily choices about how to respond to circumstances you did not choose. This is not a small reframe. It is, in the end, the entire difference between a person who is broken by the 3 marks and a person who is built by them, and the difference has almost nothing to do with the severity of the circumstances themselves and almost everything to do with the question each person chose to ask while living inside them. If you have made it this far, something in what has been said has almost certainly landed somewhere true in your own story. Whether it was the ache of a solitude no one around you fully understands, the exhaustion of a delay that has stretched far longer than you thought you could bear, or the restlessness that keeps pulling you forward even when everyone around you seems content to stay still. None of that is evidence that you are broken, unlucky, or forgotten. It is evidence that something in you is being formed for a weight most people never have to carry, and the fact that you have kept going, even without full understanding, even without applause, even without proof that any of it will eventually make sense, already places you among a smaller number of people than you probably realize. Most people quit the process the moment it stops feeling good. You have not. That alone says something about what you are actually made of. There is a reason stories about hidden preparation, unseen testing, and delayed purpose keep resurfacing across every century and every culture. And it is not because they are comforting fictions people tell themselves to feel better about hardship. It is because they describe something true about how meaningful character is actually built, a process that has never once favored the path of least resistance. The chosen were never chosen because life was easier for them. They were chosen because they kept choosing to keep going when it would have been far simpler, far more comfortable, and far more socially acceptable to stop. If that describes you, even partially, even on your hardest days, then the marks you have been carrying were never a curse in disguise. They were the specific, unglamorous, often invisible proof that something larger than your current circumstances is still being formed inside you, one difficult, ordinary day at a time. Carry that with you the next time solitude feels heavier than you can explain, the next time delay tempts you to believe you were wrong about yourself, the next time restlessness makes you feel ungrateful for a life that, by every external measure, should already be enough. You are not ungrateful. You are not forgotten. You are not behind. You are being built, quietly, in exactly the way every person who has ever carried real weight was built before you, and the only real failure available to you now is not the failure to arrive on your preferred timeline, but the failure to keep showing up while you wait for the timeline that was never yours to control in the first place. Keep showing up. That has always been the whole assignment. There is a specific moment that tends to arrive somewhere in the middle of carrying these 3 marks, and it deserves to be named because so few people are warned about it in advance. It is the moment when the cost of continuing starts to feel higher than the cost of quitting, when the solitude has lasted long enough that going back to the smaller, more understood version of your life starts to look genuinely appealing, when the delay has stretched far enough that abandoning the goal feels like relief rather than defeat, when the restlessness has worn you down enough that settling for less starts to sound like wisdom instead of surrender. This moment is not a sign that you were wrong about your calling. It is, almost without exception, the exact point at which most people give up, which is precisely why so few people ever reach what was waiting for them on the other side of it. The 3 marks do not simply test whether you can endure difficulty. They test whether you can endure difficulty at the specific moment it becomes tempting to call quitting a form of self-respect rather than what it actually is, which is an early exit from a story that had not finished being written. It helps, at this exact moment, to remember that every meaningful tradition that has tried to describe this process includes some version of a turning point that looks, from the outside, indistinguishable from failure. The night before a breakthrough rarely announces itself as the night before a breakthrough. It feels, in the moment, like just another night in an unbearable stretch of nights that have already gone on too long. This is not a reason to treat every hard night as guaranteed proof that a breakthrough is imminent, because that kind of magical thinking sets people up for a different kind of disappointment. It is, instead, a reason to stop trusting your feelings as an accurate predictor of how close or how far you actually are from what you are working toward. Feelings compress time strangely under prolonged difficulty. A season that is genuinely almost over can feel exactly as hopeless as a season with years left to run, and the only reliable response to that uncertainty is the same one that has already been named throughout this reflection: keep doing the next right thing, regardless of what your feelings are currently predicting about the outcome. There is also a quieter, more personal question worth sitting with here, away from all the historical examples and philosophical frameworks, and it is simply this: what would your life look like if you fully believed that the solitude, the delay, and the restlessness you are currently carrying were not evidence against you but evidence of exactly how seriously your life is being taken by whatever force you believe is shaping it? Would you still resent the quiet mornings where no one understands what you are building? Would you still measure your worth against people whose timeline looks nothing like yours? Would you still treat your own hunger for more as something shameful rather than something sacred? Most people never ask themselves this question directly, because it requires admitting that the story they have been telling themselves about their own suffering might be incomplete. But the people who do ask it, honestly and repeatedly, tend to be the same people who eventually look back on this exact season, the one you might be living in right now, as the one that made everything afterward possible. None of this requires you to have it figured out. It does not require certainty about your purpose, clarity about your timeline, or confidence that everything currently confusing about your life will eventually make sense. It requires only a willingness to keep interpreting your difficulty as formation rather than failure, one ordinary day at a time, for as long as that difficulty lasts. That willingness is available to you right now, in whatever season you are currently in, regardless of how far along the process feels or how uncertain the outcome remains. It was available to everyone whose story has been referenced here, long before they had any proof that their difficulty would ever resolve into something meaningful. They simply kept choosing it, day after day, without the benefit of hindsight that makes their stories look inevitable to us now. You have that same choice available to you today, in this exact moment, regardless of what yesterday looked like or what tomorrow has not yet revealed. If this reached something true in you, the most useful thing you can do right now is stay close to more of it. Subscribe to this channel so the next reflection finds you the moment it is ready, because these conversations about solitude, delay, restlessness, and the quiet architecture of a purposeful life are not one-time messages, they are an ongoing practice, and the people who grow the most from them are the ones who return to them consistently rather than encountering them once and moving on. Subscribing costs nothing, but it keeps this kind of thinking in your daily life at exactly the moments you are most likely to need it, in the middle of your own wilderness, your own delay, your own restless nights wondering whether any of it means something. It does. Subscribe, stay close, and let the next season find you already prepared for what it is building in you.